Tonight we're diving into something that might make your upcoming family dinner a little uncomfortable. We're talking about Thanksgiving. Not the version you learned about in elementary school with construction paper pilgrim hats and cardboard turkeys. No, we're going to pull back the curtain on what really happened in 1621 and the centuries that followed. Before we begin, let me ask you to do something. If you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the darker corners of history, consider subscribing. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this community spread across time zones, all here for the same reason, the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. Now dim the lights, get comfortable. And let's talk about a story that's been carefully sanitized, deliberately mythologized, and sold to generations as a heartwarming tale of friendship and gratitude. The truth, as you might expect, is far more complex, far more tragic, and far more important than the fairy tale we've been told. Picture this. It's November, probably late September through early November of 1621, though we can't be certain of the exact dates. Somewhere in what we now call Plymouth, Massachusetts, a 3-day gathering is taking place. There are roughly 90 Wampanoag men, led by their sachem Massasoit. There are 53 English colonists, the survivors of a brutal first year that killed half their number. They're eating together. They're engaged in military demonstrations. There are games, diplomacy, and yes, food. This is the event we now call the First Thanksgiving. Except nobody called it that at the time. Nobody thought of it as the beginning of an American tradition. It wasn't even called Thanksgiving. It was a harvest celebration, something both cultures did regularly, for entirely different reasons. But here's what you need to understand right from the start. This wasn't a story about friendship. It wasn't about pilgrims and Indians coming together in harmony. It was politics. It was strategy. It was survival. For both sides, though for very different reasons. And what came after, in the decades and centuries that followed, would be nothing short of catastrophic for the indigenous peoples of New England. The story you're about to hear involves kidnapping, slavery, epidemic disease that wiped out entire villages, grave robbing, calculated political manoeuvring, broken treaties, war, genocide, and the deliberate creation of a myth designed to cover up one of the darkest chapters in American history. So no, this isn't the Thanksgiving story you learned in school. This is what actually happened, and it's a story that matters, not just for historical accuracy, but because the consequences of these events are still being felt today. Native Americans haven't forgotten. Many don't celebrate Thanksgiving at all. Since 1970, they've gathered every fourth Thursday of November for something else entirely, a National Day of Mourning. So let's start at the beginning. Not in 1621, not with the Mayflower, but with the land itself and the people who had lived there for thousands of years before a single European ship ever appeared on the horizon. Long before the Mayflower, long before any English colonists set foot in Massachusetts, long before the word America meant anything to anyone, the land that would become Plymouth was home. The Wampanoag people had lived in what is now southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island for more than 12,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment. 12,000 years. While Europe was emerging from the last ice age, while the first farmers were planting crops in the Fertile Crescent, the ancestors of the Wampanoag were already here, already thriving, already building a complex society that would endure for millennia. They called their homeland different things in different dialects of the Algonquian language family, but the land itself was rich, abundant and carefully tended. This wasn't wilderness. That's a European concept. The idea of untamed land waiting to be civilized. The Wampanoag had been managing this landscape for thousands of generations. They used controlled burns to clear underbrush, creating park-like forests that were easy to travel through and that attracted game. They planted the Three Sisters, corn, beans and squash, in companion gardens where each plant supported the others. They fished the rivers and the coast. They harvested oysters, clams and lobsters. They hunted deer, turkey, and waterfowl. Their society was sophisticated, organised into a confederacy of nations. The Wampanoag Confederacy included the Pokanoket, the Nauset, the Mashpee, and many others. Each had their own sachems, their own territories, their own customs. But they were connected by language, by trade, by kinship, by shared ceremonies and beliefs. Their homes, called weetus, were dome-shaped structures made from bent saplings and covered with bark or woven mats. These weren't primitive shelters. They were engineered for the climate, warm in winter, cool in summer, easily repaired and relocated when needed. Extended families lived together. Children were raised communally. Knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, through stories that encoded everything from navigation to medicine to history. Let's be clear about something. The Wampanoag were not a peaceful utopian society living in perfect harmony. No human society is. They had conflicts with neighbouring tribes. They had territorial disputes. They fought wars. But they also had sophisticated diplomatic systems, trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles, and a deep understanding of sustainable living that allowed them to thrive in this place for millennia without depleting it. They understood something that Europeans didn't, or chose not to, that you couldn't own land. You could use it, steward it, benefit from its resources. But the idea of one person or family claiming permanent exclusive ownership of a piece of earth was foreign to them. Land was a responsibility, not a commodity. This fundamental difference in worldview would become one of the greatest sources of conflict when the Europeans arrived. The Wampanoag had a spiritual worldview that saw all living things as interconnected. They gave thanks regularly, not just once a year but throughout the seasons, whenever something significant happened. A successful hunt, the first corn harvest, the return of fish to the rivers. These Thanksgivings were about acknowledging the relationship between humans and the natural world, about maintaining balance and reciprocity. Their population before European contact is hard to estimate precisely, but historians believe there were between 50,000 to 100,000 Wampanoag people living in the region. Villages dotted the coastline and river valleys. Some were permanent settlements. Others were seasonal camps used for fishing, farming or hunting. The area around what would become Plymouth had been home to the Patuxet people, a subset of the larger Wampanoag nation. The Patuxet village was in an ideal location. Fresh water from what's now called Town Brook. Rich soil for planting, easy access to the sea for fishing, protected harbour. It had been inhabited for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence shows layer upon layer of human occupation, extending back into deep time. This was the world that existed before 1620. A world of nations, not emptiness. A world of culture, not savagery. A world where people had lived successfully for longer than recorded European history. And it was about to be shattered, because by 1620, when the Mayflower arrived, something horrific had already happened. The Patuxet village was empty. The fields were overgrown. The homes were abandoned. Of the thousands of people who had lived there, not a single one remained. They were all dead, every last one of them. The English colonists who arrived would describe the land as practically deserted, as if Providence itself had cleared it for them. But this wasn't divine intervention. This was disease, European disease, and it had arrived before the Mayflower. Between 1616 and 1619, something terrible swept through the native populations of New England. They called it the Great Dying. Europeans would later claim it was God clearing the land for them, but it was nothing supernatural. It was biology. It was epidemiology. It was the catastrophic collision of two worlds that had been separated for millennia. For thousands of years, the peoples of the Americas had been isolated from the Old World. They had never been exposed to smallpox, measles, influenza, bubonic plague, typhus, or any of the other diseases that had swept through European, Asian, and African populations for centuries. Europeans had developed some resistance to these diseases through generations of exposure, though they still killed millions. But Native Americans had no immunity whatsoever. None. Zero. Their bodies had never encountered these pathogens. When European explorers began probing the coast of New England in the early 1600s, they brought these diseases with them, sometimes deliberately, often inadvertently. A sick sailor, contaminated trade goods, infected domestic animals. The pathogens didn't need much. They found virgin territory, immunologically speaking, and they spread like wildfire. The epidemic that struck between 1616 and 1619 was devastating beyond comprehension. Entire villages were wiped out. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the native population in coastal New England died in just 3 years. 90%. Let that number settle in your mind. Imagine 9 out of every 10 people you know dying in 3 years. Your family, your neighbours, your community, your culture, your accumulated knowledge, all gone. For centuries this epidemic was assumed to be smallpox, but recent research suggests it might have been something else entirely. Leptospirosis. This is a bacterial infection typically transmitted through water or soil contaminated by the waste of infected animals, especially domestic animals like rats, which would have been present on European ships. The symptoms match what native survivors described: high fever, intense pain, bleeding, and death within days. Whatever the exact pathogen, the result was the same: catastrophe. The Patuxet were completely annihilated, every single person. When Tisquantum, whom we'll talk about extensively in a moment, returned to his village in 1619 after 5 years abroad, he found nothing but bones and ghosts. The cornfields were overgrown, the witters were collapsed, his entire people were gone. He was, as far as he knew, the last of the Patuxet. But it wasn't just the Patuxet. The epidemic ravaged the entire region. The Pokanoket, the Massachusetts, the Nauset all suffered massive losses. Massasoit, who had become the central native figure in the Thanksgiving story, saw his people reduced from thousands to hundreds. His power, his influence, his ability to defend his territory, all severely diminished. English explorers who visited the coast in the years immediately following the epidemic described walking for days and finding only empty villages, unburied bodies, and overgrown fields. One wrote of sailing past mile after mile of cleared land with no one living there. Another described bones bleaching in the sun everywhere he looked. The native peoples who survived were traumatized, weakened, and vulnerable in ways they had never been before. Their population was decimated, their social structures were disrupted, their carefully maintained diplomatic and trade networks were shattered. Villages that had stood for centuries were abandoned. Sacred sites were left untended. The accumulated wisdom of elders was lost when entire generations died. And here's the thing that makes this even more tragic. The survivors knew exactly what had caused this catastrophe. They knew it was the Europeans. They had seen the pattern. A ship arrives, trade happens, and then, weeks or months later, people start dying. They weren't stupid. They understood cause and effect. They knew that contact with Europeans meant death. So when the Mayflower arrived in November 1620, landing at the site of the abandoned Patuxet village, the Wampanoag were watching. They saw these newcomers exploring the coastline, building structures, stumbling through the woods, and they had to make a choice. Attack them? Avoid them? Make contact? What happened next wasn't friendship. It was a calculated political decision made by a leader trying to protect what remained of his people. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand the famous First Thanksgiving, we need to talk about one man whose story is so extraordinary, so unlikely, and so deliberately misrepresented in the traditional narrative that it borders on fiction. His name was Tisquantum. You probably know him as Squanto, and his story is the key to everything. Imagine this. You're in your early 20s, maybe late teens. You live in a thriving coastal village where your family has lived for generations. You're a member of the Patuxet people, part of the larger Wampanoag nation. Your life is ordinary in the best possible way. Fishing, farming, participating in the cycles of the season, learning from your elders, spending time with family and friends. Then, one day in 1614, a European ship arrives. The captain, Thomas Hunt, seems friendly. He's interested in trade. He invites you and about 24 other young men from your village and neighbouring communities aboard to discuss business. You see no reason to be suspicious. Europeans have been visiting intermittently. Some trade has happened. Why not see what they have to offer? You board the ship, and suddenly everything changes. You're grabbed, restrained, thrown below deck with the others. The ship sets sail. You're being kidnapped. You and 26 other men, stolen from your homes, your families, your lives. This was Tisquantum's reality. This actually happened. Captain Thomas Hunt, who had been sailing with the more famous John Smith on an exploratory mission, decided to maximise his profits by engaging in human trafficking. Slavery. He kidnapped at least 27 native men from the Massachusetts coast, locked them in the hold of his ship, and sailed for Spain, intending to sell them in the slave markets of Malaga. Think about what this meant. Tisquantum had never been on a ship before. He had never left his homeland. He didn't speak English or Spanish. He was torn away from everything and everyone he knew, with no idea where he was going or why, surrounded by men who saw him not as a person, but as cargo. The voyage took months. The conditions in the hold would have been nightmarish. Dark, cramped, filthy, with minimal food and water. Some of the captives may have died during the crossing. When they finally arrived in Malaga, Spain, sometime in late 1614, Hunt attempted to sell them in the slave market. But here, something unexpected happened. Local Franciscan friars intervened. Enslaving Native Americans was technically illegal under Spanish law, though this law was frequently ignored. The friars managed to rescue at least some of the captives, including Tisquantum. They took them to local monasteries, where they were housed, educated, and presumably converted to Christianity. Spanish records discovered in recent decades confirm that Tisquantum spent time in the custody of these religious orders. Now, think about what this must have been like. Tisquantum is in a completely foreign environment. The architecture, the food, the climate, the language, the religion, everything is alien. He has no way of knowing if he'll ever see his home again. He has no way of contacting his family, of letting them know he's alive. They probably think he's dead. He might as well be. But Tisquantum was resourceful. He learned Spanish. He learned about European culture, European technology, European ways of thinking. And somehow, through connections we're not entirely sure of, he made his way to England, probably aboard a merchant ship. In London, Tisquantum found work with a shipbuilder named John Slaney. He lived in the neighbourhood of Cornhill, in the heart of one of the world's busiest cities. He learned English, becoming fluent. He absorbed English customs, English politics, English views on the world. He was no longer just a Patuxet man. He was becoming something else, someone who existed between worlds. He tried to get back home. He made connections with English merchants and explorers interested in New England. In 1617, he signed on with an expedition to Newfoundland as a guide and interpreter. From there, he managed to join another expedition headed south, led by Captain Thomas Dermer, that would finally bring him back to the Massachusetts coast. It was 1619. Tisquantum had been gone for 5 years. He had been enslaved, had lived in Spain, had worked in London, had travelled to Newfoundland. He had seen things no other member of his people had seen. He had learned things that made him uniquely valuable as an intermediary between two worlds, and then he came home and found everyone dead. The epidemic had struck while he was gone. The Patuxet village was empty. His family, his friends, his entire community wiped out. He was the only survivor, not because he was lucky, but because he had been kidnapped. The same traumatic event that had separated him from his people had also saved his life. Think about what that does to a person. The guilt, the grief, the profound isolation. He couldn't even properly mourn or conduct the funerary rites his culture required because there was no one left to do them with. He was culturally adrift, caught between a world that no longer existed and a European world that would never fully accept him. Tisquantum went to live with the Pokanoket, with Massasoit's people. He was given shelter, but he wasn't really one of them. He was Patuxet. He spoke English fluently, which made him valuable but also suspicious. Had his time with the Europeans changed him? Could he be trusted? These were real questions. When the Mayflower arrived in December 1620 and the colonists began building their settlement on the ruins of Tisquantum's village, Massasoit watched and waited through the winter. And when spring came, he made his move. He sent an ambassador, first Samoset, an Abenaki from Maine who spoke some English, and then Tisquantum, who spoke it fluently. The colonists saw Tisquantum as a gift from God. William Bradford, who would become governor of Plymouth Colony, wrote that Tisquantum was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. They had no idea what he'd been through. They didn't care. To them he was a tool, a convenience, proof that God favoured their mission. But Tisquantum had his own agenda. He taught the colonists how to plant corn using fish as fertiliser. He showed them where to hunt and fish. He acted as translator between them and Massasoit. He made himself indispensable. But he was also playing both sides against each other. Edward Winslow, one of the colonists who knew him well, wrote that Tisquantum sought his own ends and played his own game. He would tell the English that Massasoit was plotting against them, and tell the Wampanoag that he could control the English, that he could make them attack or withdraw at his command. He claimed to have special powers, supernatural connections. He was trying to use his unique position to gain influence, maybe even to challenge Massasoit's authority. It didn't work. Massasoit figured out what was happening and demanded that the English turn Tisquantum over to him for punishment. Bradford refused, needing Tisquantum too much. The tension simmered, and then, in November 1622, barely a year after that famous harvest celebration, Tisquantum died of a sudden fever while on a trading expedition with the colonists. Some historians speculate he was poisoned by Massasoit's people. Others think he simply succumbed to disease. We'll never know. But his death removed a complicated figure, someone who existed in the space between two worlds and satisfied neither. The traditional Thanksgiving narrative paints Tisquantum as a simple, friendly Indian who helped the Pilgrims out of pure kindness, then disappears from the story. The reality is so much more complex, so much more tragic, so much more human. He was a survivor of kidnapping and slavery. He was the last of his people. He was trying to navigate an impossible situation, to find power and meaning in a world that had taken everything from him. His story alone should be enough to complicate the simple Thanksgiving narrative we've been fed. But we're just getting started. Because we need to talk about those English colonists, the ones we call Pilgrims, though they never called themselves that. We need to talk about their desperate journey, their brutal first winter, and the things they did to survive that the traditional story conveniently leaves out. September the 16th, 1620, the port of Plymouth, England. A merchant ship called the Mayflower, about 100 feet long, and typically used to transport cargo like wine and cloth, is preparing for an unusual voyage. Crammed aboard 102 passengers, plus a crew of about 30. These aren't explorers or soldiers, they're families. Men, women, children, even infants. About half are religious separatists, radical Protestants who'd broken away from the Church of England and lived in exile in the Netherlands before deciding to try their luck in the New World. The other half are what they called strangers, people recruited by the London investors funding the voyage, looking for economic opportunity rather than religious freedom. These two groups didn't particularly like each other, and that tension would simmer throughout the voyage and beyond. The Mayflower wasn't designed for passenger travel. The living quarters were cramped beyond belief, about 1,600 square feet with 5-foot ceilings for 102 people. Imagine being locked in a moderately sized apartment with 100 other people for 2 months. with the floor and walls constantly pitching and rolling, with the smell of vomit, unwashed bodies, and waste barrels, with the constant fear that the ship might sink. Because they almost did sink, multiple times. The voyage was a nightmare. They left in September, late in the season, and immediately ran into the kind of autumn storms the North Atlantic is famous for. Massive waves crashed over the deck, the ship leaked, a main support beam cracked halfway through the voyage, threatening the structural integrity of the entire vessel. They had to repair it mid-ocean using a giant screwjack they'd brought for building houses. One man was washed overboard but somehow managed to grab a trailing rope and was pulled back aboard. Another fell overboard and drowned. For 66 days they endured this. Most people were too seasick to eat. Children cried constantly. Adults argued and prayed and despaired. The crew, rough sailors who had signed up for a simple cargo run, resented and mocked the passengers. One particularly cruel crew member, mocking the suffering passengers and saying he was looking forward to throwing their corpses overboard, became violently ill himself and was the first to die on the voyage. The religious passengers saw this as divine judgment, which probably didn't improve relations with the crew. They were supposed to land near the Hudson River, in what's now New York, where they had permission from the Virginia Company to establish a settlement. But the storms had blown them off course, and when they finally sighted land on November 9th, they were near Cape Cod, about 200 miles north of their intended destination. They tried to sail south but ran into dangerous shoals and nearly wrecked the ship. Desperate, exhausted, with winter approaching, they decided to stay in the Cape Cod area. This created a legal problem. They were outside the jurisdiction of any English authority. Technically, they had no right to be there, and no legal framework to govern themselves. Some of the strangers started talking about doing whatever they wanted once they landed, refusing to follow the religious separatist rules. To prevent chaos, the men drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact, an agreement to govern themselves by majority rule, and to create just and equal laws for the good of the colony. It's often hailed as an early example of democracy and self-government in America, a cornerstone of American political tradition. But let's be clear, only 41 men signed it. Not the women, not the children, not the servants. And its immediate purpose was to maintain control by the religious faction over the more secular passengers who were threatening to go their own way. On November 11th, some of the men went ashore at what's now Provincetown to scout. They were desperate for fresh water and food, and almost immediately they stumbled onto something that would help them survive, a Wampanoag grave and a cache of buried corn. They dug up the grave. They stole the corn. They also found beans and other seed stores hidden by the Wampanoag for winter use. They took everything they could carry, promising themselves they would repay it later. They never did, by the way. This wasn't a trade. It was theft. Grave robbing and theft. This is in William Bradford's own account, though he frames it as Providence providing for them. For several weeks they explored Cape Cod and the surrounding area, looking for a suitable place to settle. They had several violent encounters with native people, who understandably weren't thrilled about these armed foreigners poking around their territory. In one incident at what's now called First Encounter Beach, Wampanoag warriors attacked a scouting party with arrows. The English fired their muskets, and the Wampanoag withdrew. No one was killed, but the message was clear. The locals were not welcoming. Finally, in mid-December, they found a place that seemed perfect. A cleared harbour with fresh water, abandoned fields ready for planting, and several hills for building. It was the former site of Patuxet village. They didn't know yet that everyone who had lived there was dead. They just saw empty, prepared land and thought God had cleared it for them. On December 23rd, the Mayflower anchored in Plymouth Harbour. They began building their settlement, and then winter hit for real. The winter of 1620 to 1621 wasn't particularly harsh by New England standards. It was actually relatively mild. But for people who were already weakened by the voyage, who lacked proper shelter, who didn't know how to hunt or fish effectively in this environment, who had inadequate food supplies, it was devastating. They lived on the Mayflower through most of the winter because their settlement wasn't built yet. The ship became a floating coffin. Scurvy ravaged them, caused by lack of vitamin C. Pneumonia killed dozens. They had brought European diseases with them, and in their weakened, crowded conditions these diseases spread rapidly. People died at a horrifying rate, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. By the end of winter, about half of the 102 passengers were dead. Of the 26 men who could hold leadership positions, only 12 survived. Of the 18 adult women, only 4 lived to see spring. Families were destroyed, children were orphaned. The living barely had strength to bury the dead. And they did bury them, but secretly, at night, on what's now called Coles Hill, overlooking the harbour. They tried to hide the graves, levelling the ground because they didn't want the native people watching them to know how weak they were. They were terrified that if the Wampanoag realised how few of them were left, they would attack and wipe them out completely. The crew of the Mayflower didn't escape either. About half of them died as well, including the ship's captain, Christopher Jones, though he survived the winter itself and died later. The surviving crew wanted nothing more than to leave, to get away from this death trap and back to England. In the midst of this suffering, there's a particularly grim detail that often gets left out of the story. Dorothy Bradford, the wife of William Bradford, who had become governor of the colony, drowned in Cape Cod Harbour, while the Mayflower was still anchored there in December. The official record just says she fell overboard, but the timing, coming just a few weeks after arrival, after the stress of the voyage and the realisation of how bleak their situation was, has led some historians to speculate that her death may not have been accidental. Bradford never wrote about it in detail, which was unusual for him given how extensively he documented other events. We'll never know the truth, but it's worth noting that suicide, especially by women in desperate circumstances, was not unknown in early colonial settlements. By March 1621, when the weather began to improve, the Plymouth colony consisted of about 50 traumatised, malnourished, frightened survivors huddled in a few poorly constructed buildings, surrounded by empty houses and fresh graves, in a land that had proven far more hostile than they had imagined. They should have died. All of them. They would have died. But then something happened. In March 1621, a Wampanoag man named Samoset walked into the settlement, raised his hand in greeting and said in English, "Welcome, Englishman." The colonists were astounded. How did this Indian speak English? Where did he come from? What did he want? Samoset, who was actually Abenaki from Maine, and had learned English from fishermen who worked the coast, told them about the Wampanoag, about Massasoit and about someone else, Tisquantum, who spoke even better English and who could help them. A few days later, Tisquantum arrived, and the famous friendship between the Pilgrims and Indians began, except it wasn't friendship. Not really, it was politics, it was strategy, it was a calculated alliance based on mutual need. Let's talk about what really happened. Autumn 1621. The colonists have survived their first year. Barely. They've planted crops with Tisquantum's help, corn using the Three Sisters method, and English crops that mostly failed. They've learned to fish the local waters and hunt waterfowl. They've established a treaty with Massasoit and the Pokanoket Wampanoag. The worst seems to be over. The corn harvest comes in. It's not abundant, but it's something. After nearly starving through the winter, after watching half their number die, after confronting the very real possibility that they would all perish, this harvest represents survival. It deserves to be celebrated. Governor William Bradford decides to hold a celebration. This is important. It's not a Thanksgiving in the religious sense. The Puritan concept of Thanksgiving was a solemn day of prayer and fasting, not feasting. That would come later in 1623. This is simply a harvest festival, the kind of secular celebration that was common in English culture. Bradford sends 4 men out to hunt fowl. We don't know exactly what kind. The single contemporary account, a letter written by Edward Winslow, mentions fowl but doesn't specify. Turkey is often assumed, and there were wild turkeys in the area, though they were notoriously difficult to hunt with the weapons the colonists had. More likely, they brought down ducks, geese, and other waterfowl that were plentiful in the fall and easier to kill, maybe swan. The important point is that we don't actually know. Winslow writes that these 4 men in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. So we're talking about a significant amount of wild bird. They also had the harvest, corn, beans, squash. They had access to seafood, fish, clams, mussels, possibly lobster and eels, which were abundant and considered common food. They might have had some salted pork or beef from their English supplies, though this would have been precious and unlikely to be used for a celebration. Then something interesting happens. According to Winslow, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor. Let's pause on this. The traditional story makes it sound like the colonists invited the Wampanoag to share a friendly feast. That's probably not what happened. Most historians now believe that the Wampanoag heard the noise of the English celebration, the military exercises, the gunfire, and came to investigate. Remember, Massasoit had a treaty with these colonists, but that didn't mean he trusted them. When you hear explosions and demonstrations of military power from people who are armed and unpredictable, you show up with force. Massasoit arrived with 90 men. The English colony at this point consisted of about 50 people, including women and children, so the Wampanoag outnumbered them nearly 2 to 1. This wasn't a small dinner party. This was a significant show of force, a reminder of who held the real power in this relationship. And the Wampanoag didn't just show up empty-handed to be fed. They brought 5 deer. This is significant. In Wampanoag culture, when you arrive as guests, you contribute to the meal. It's a matter of respect and reciprocity. The deer they brought would have been far more valuable, both nutritionally and culturally, than the fowl the English had killed. Venison was prized, and the ability to hunt deer successfully was a mark of skill and status. So what would this feast have actually looked like? Forget the Norman Rockwell painting. Forget the long wooden table with everyone sitting together nicely. This was outdoors, in the fall, probably chilly. The English and Wampanoag almost certainly didn't all eat together at one time. They would have eaten in shifts, in separate groups, with the men probably eating before the women and children, as was customary in both cultures at the time. The food would have been simple by our standards, but fairly abundant by theirs. Roasted fowl and venison. Corn prepared in various ways. Boiled, made into a kind of porridge, or baked into bread. Beans and squash, probably stewed together. Seafood, fish, eels, shellfish. Wild nuts, walnuts, chestnuts. Possibly wild berries or dried fruits, though by late September or early November these would have been past season. What wasn't there? Almost everything we associate with Thanksgiving dinner today. No turkey, or at least we can't confirm there was turkey. No potatoes, white or sweet, those hadn't reached New England yet. No cranberry sauce, even though cranberries were native to the area, because the English didn't have sugar to make sauce. No pumpkin pie, no mashed anything, no stuffing as we know it, no butter, no wheat flour, no ovens to bake pies. The food would have been roasted over open fires or boiled in pots. No formal seating arrangement, no china or silverware. The English would have used wooden trenchers and spoons, and the Wampanoag would have used their traditional implements or hands. No giving thanks in the Puritan religious sense, though there may have been prayers, and the Wampanoag certainly would have honoured the harvest in their own spiritual way. The celebration lasted 3 days. During this time there were competitive games, probably tests of skill and strength, common in both English and Wampanoag culture. There were military exercises, demonstrations of English musketry and Wampanoag archery. This wasn't just friendly fun. Both sides were showing off their military capabilities, a subtle but clear message about power and deterrence. There was diplomatic conversation, undoubtedly mediated by Tisquantum and possibly Samoset. These discussions would have reinforced the treaty, discussed trade, addressed any grievances or concerns. Politics was happening here, negotiations between two groups with very different goals and expectations. And then it was over. The Wampanoag went home, the English went back to work, preparing for another winter. There's no evidence that either side thought of this as the beginning of an annual tradition. In fact, there's no evidence they ever did it again. The next recorded Thanksgiving in Plymouth Colony was in 1623, but that was the religious kind, a day of prayer and fasting in response to rain ending a drought. For decades, this 1621 event was barely remembered. Neither Bradford nor Winslow wrote about it extensively. It wasn't mentioned in histories or sermons. It wasn't commemorated or celebrated. It was just a thing that happened once, noted briefly and then forgotten. So how did it become the first Thanksgiving, the foundational American holiday, the sacred story of Pilgrims and Indians coming together in friendship? We'll get to that. But first, we need to understand what this event really was beneath the surface. Because it wasn't about friendship. It was about politics, power, and survival. And the decisions made during this period would have devastating consequences that neither side could have fully predicted. Let's talk about what was really happening in March 1621 when Massasoit decided to make contact with the English colonists and establish a treaty. Because this is where the traditional narrative really starts to fall apart. The story we've been told is about friendly Indians helping helpless pilgrims out of pure kindness, teaching them to farm and hunt, welcoming them with open arms. That's not what happened. What happened was cold, hard politics. Massasoit, whose name was actually Usamaquern, Massasoit was his title, meaning Great Sachem, was not making decisions based on compassion or cross-cultural friendship. He was making strategic calculations based on the reality of his position, and that reality was grim. Before the epidemic of 1616 to 1619, the Pokanoket Wampanoag had been a significant power in the region. They had a population of several thousand, controlled valuable territory, and were players in the complex diplomatic and trade networks of New England. But the epidemic had devastated them. Their population was reduced by perhaps 60 to 90%. Their military strength was shattered. Their political influence was weakened. Worse, their traditional rivals, the Narragansett to the west, had been largely spared by the epidemic. They remained strong, numerous, and ambitious. The balance of power in the region had shifted dramatically against the Wampanoag. Massasoit was vulnerable, and he knew it. Then these English colonists arrived. They were weak, sickly, incompetent at survival in this environment. But they had something valuable: guns, muskets, firearms that made a terrifying noise and could kill from a distance. The Wampanoag had encountered firearms before from earlier European contacts, and they understood the tactical advantage these weapons represented. So Massasoit faced a choice. He could try to drive the English out, which was probably feasible given how weak they were, but that would expend resources and warriors he couldn't spare, and it would gain him nothing. Or he could try to use them, make them allies, get access to their technology and trade goods, use their military power as a deterrent against the Narragansett and other rivals. It's important to understand that this wasn't a decision Massasoit made alone or without opposition. Wampanoag society was more democratic than English society in many ways. Sachems led through consensus, not absolute authority. They had to persuade their people and their councillors. There were definitely Wampanoag who thought making any kind of alliance with these Europeans was a terrible idea. They'd seen what happened when Europeans arrived: disease, death, disruption. Why invite more contact? But Massasoit made his case, and it prevailed. The alliance would be on specific terms. The treaty that was negotiated, probably in March 1621, with Tisquantum serving as interpreter, laid out mutual obligations. The English and Wampanoag would not harm each other. They would return any weapons or tools that were stolen. They would come to each other's aid if attacked by outside forces. Each side would administer justice to its own people, not the others. From Massasoit's perspective, this last point was crucial. The English would not have authority over the Wampanoag. They were not subjects or subordinates. They were allies of necessity. This was a relationship between sovereign nations, not between masters and servants. The treaty also had an interesting clause. When Wampanoag visited the English settlement, they would leave their weapons outside the settlement. But when English came to Wampanoag territory, they could keep their weapons. This seems unequal, but it actually makes sense from a Wampanoag perspective. Their lands were their lands. If the English felt unsafe there, they could bring their guns. But the English settlement was, in Wampanoag eyes, still Wampanoag land. The English were essentially tenants, not owners. Having armed visitors in your own territory is different from allowing armed guests in a settlement you're visiting. The English, of course, saw it very differently. They believed they now owned this land through some combination of discovery, occupation, and purchase, though the Wampanoag had never agreed to sell. This fundamental disagreement about land ownership, about what the treaty actually meant, would cause endless problems down the line. But for now, in 1621, the treaty held. And it held because both sides needed it. The English needed the Wampanoag to teach them how to survive in this environment, how to plant corn, when to plant it, how to prepare the soil, what to plant with it, how to fish the waters, when different fish would run, what techniques worked, where to hunt, what game was available, how to track and trap it. The Wampanoag had 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge about this landscape, and the English had none. Tisquantum was central to this transfer of knowledge. He taught them the famous technique of planting fish with corn as fertilizer, burying alewives or other small fish in the mounds to enrich the soil. He showed them where to hunt for deer, how to stalk them, how to read the land. He identified edible plants and taught them which roots and berries were safe. Without this knowledge, the English probably would have died. All of them. But the Wampanoag weren't doing this out of kindness. They were doing it because they needed the English alive and functional. A colony of starving, dying Englishmen was useless as an ally. The Wampanoag needed them to be strong enough to be credible military partners, to have something to offer in trade, to be worth maintaining the alliance with. And what did the Wampanoag get in return? Access to English goods, metal tools, axes, knives, nails, cloth, glass beads that had value in their trade networks, and most importantly, the implicit protection of English military power. When Massasoit negotiated with the Narragansett or other neighbours, he could now point to his English allies with their guns. It changed the strategic calculation. The harvest celebration in autumn 1621 needs to be understood in this context. It wasn't a Thanksgiving, it was a diplomatic summit. It was a demonstration of military capability on both sides. It was a reaffirmation of the treaty. It was politics. Massasoit brought 90 warriors. That's not a friendly social visit, that's a show of force. He was reminding the English that while they had their guns, the Wampanoag had numbers, organisation and knowledge of the terrain. The message was clear: we're allies, but don't get any ideas about being our masters. The English responded with their own show. They fired their muskets in demonstration. They showed off their military discipline. They hosted the Wampanoag for 3 days, demonstrating that they had enough food and resources to support unexpected guests, that they weren't as weak as they had been. Both sides left that celebration understanding the balance of power. The alliance would continue because both sides still needed it. But it was an alliance of convenience, not affection, and it was fragile. Within a year or two, cracks were already showing. Tisquantum's manipulation, playing both sides against each other, nearly broke the alliance. Massasoit figured out what Tisquantum was doing and demanded he be turned over for punishment. Bradford refused. This created tension. The English were protecting someone who was undermining Massasoit's authority, and Massasoit had to calculate whether it was worth breaking the alliance over. He decided it wasn't. Not yet. The alliance was still useful, but the seeds of distrust had been planted, and there's something else that often gets overlooked. Not all English colonists respected the treaty. Not all of them saw the Wampanoag as allies to be honoured. As more English arrived, as the colony grew stronger, as new settlements were founded, the strategic calculus changed. The English needed the Wampanoag less. And when the Wampanoag became less useful, they became obstacles instead. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before we talk about what came after, we need to address something that the traditional Thanksgiving narrative completely erases. The grave robbing, the theft, the sacrilege that the English committed from the very beginning of their presence in this land. Remember that moment in November and December 1620 when the Mayflower passengers first went ashore at Cape Cod? Remember how they were desperate, starving, facing winter with inadequate supplies? Let's talk about what they actually did, using their own words from their own accounts, because this is something that usually gets glossed over or sanitized in the traditional Thanksgiving narrative. William Bradford, the future governor who chronicled the Plymouth Colony's history, describes their early explorations of Cape Cod. A party of men went ashore armed to scout for fresh water and resources. They quickly found signs of human habitation, cleared fields, remnants of structures, and then they found something else, a large basket buried in a mound of earth. They dug it up. Inside was seed corn stored by the Wampanoag for winter planting. This corn had been carefully selected, the best ears saved for the next year's crop. It represented not just food, but the continuation of agriculture, the future. The English took it, all of it, as much as they could carry, but they didn't stop there. As they continued exploring, they found more caches of corn and beans, more buried stores. They took everything. Bradford estimates they stole about 10 bushels of corn and beans from various hiding places. That's a significant amount of food that the Wampanoag had worked to grow, harvest and store, food they would need to survive and to plant in spring. Then things got worse. They found graves, Wampanoag burial sites where the dead had been laid to rest, with grave goods according to their customs. And the English dug them up. They opened the graves, they examined the contents, they took things. In their defence, if you can call it that, they later claimed they didn't know these were graves at first. They thought they were storage mounds. But once they realised what they were, they should have stopped. In both English and Wampanoag culture, disturbing the dead was taboo, a serious violation of cultural and spiritual norms. The English understood this. They did it anyway. Bradford describes finding a grave that contained the remains of a man with blonde hair and European items, probably a European sailor who had died and been buried by the native people with respect. Near him were the remains of a child. The English examined these remains, took note of the grave goods, and then, to their credit, reburied them. But the very act of opening the grave was a violation. Other graves they found, they robbed more thoroughly. They took baskets, bowls, beads, anything that seemed useful or valuable. They literally robbed the dead. Now you might argue that they were desperate. They were starving. They needed the corn to survive. That's fair to a point. But here's the thing. They knew this was theft. They knew this was wrong. Bradford writes that they intended to repay the Indians for the corn when they had the chance, so soon as they could. But they never did. Years went by. They established the colony. They had opportunities to make restitution. They never bothered. And it gets worse because this wasn't just about stealing food. This was about violating sacred spaces, about desecrating sites that held deep spiritual significance for the Wampanoag. In Wampanoag culture, as in most cultures, the dead are not truly gone. They're ancestors. They watch over the living. The places where they're buried are sacred ground. To disturb them is to disrupt the connection between the living and the dead, to dishonour both. The Wampanoag would have known what happened. They would have checked their storage sites and found them empty. They would have visited their burial grounds and found them disturbed. They would have known exactly who did it. The strangers who had just arrived on the ship, the armed men in strange clothing. This is part of why the Wampanoag who encountered the English during those early explorations were hostile. There's an incident at First Encounter Beach where Wampanoag warriors attacked a scouting party with arrows. The traditional story presents this as unprovoked aggression, as if the Wampanoag were just naturally violent. But they had reasons. These foreigners had violated their graves, stolen their food, and were now trespassing on their land with weapons drawn. The English response was to fire their muskets, to use overwhelming force. The Wampanoag withdrew, but not because they were defeated, because they were strategic. These foreigners had powerful weapons. Fighting them openly would be costly. Better to watch, to wait, to see what happened. When Massasoit eventually decided to make contact and establish a treaty, he did so with full knowledge of what the English had done. The grave robbing, the theft, the violence at First Encounter Beach, he knew all of it. And he made the strategic decision that despite these violations, an alliance was still in his people's best interest. Think about what that means. The Sachem of a people who had just lost 60 to 90% of their population to disease looked at these foreigners who had desecrated his people's graves and stolen their food and decided to help them anyway. Not because he was naive, not because he was trusting, but because the alternative, letting them die or driving them out, seemed worse given the strategic situation with the Narragansett and others. This context never makes it into the Thanksgiving story we tell children. We don't talk about how the Pilgrims robbed graves. We don't mention the theft of food. We don't explain that the Wampanoag had every reason to be hostile and chose diplomacy instead. Not out of friendship, but out of strategic necessity. And this pattern continued. As Plymouth Colony grew, as more English arrived, they continued to take what they wanted. They purchased land through treaties that the Wampanoag didn't understand, where concepts like individual land ownership didn't translate, where alcohol and pressure were used to secure signatures. They grazed their livestock on land the Wampanoag used for hunting and gathering, destroying the resources the native people depended on. They cut down forests without permission, disrupting carefully managed ecosystems. Every year, the English took more land, more resources, more power, and every year, the Wampanoag had less territory, less game, less autonomy, less hope that this relationship would ever be one of equals. The patience and forbearance shown by Massasoit and the Wampanoag in the face of this ongoing theft and violation is remarkable. They maintained the peace treaty for decades, far longer than most people realize, through the 1620s, 1630s, 1640s, and into the 1650s. Massasoit died in 1661, having kept the peace with Plymouth Colony for 40 years despite countless provocations and broken promises. But that peace came at enormous cost to his people. It required them to swallow their anger, to watch their land be taken, to see their way of life disrupted and destroyed bit by bit. And eventually the cost became too high. Eventually there was no more room for compromise, no more tolerance for betrayal. When Massasoit's son Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, became Sachem, he inherited a situation that was unsustainable. The English were everywhere now. They outnumbered the Wampanoag. They had taken most of the best land. They were demanding that the Wampanoag give up their weapons, submit to English law, convert to Christianity. They were treating the Wampanoag not as allies, but as subjects, not as equals, but as inferiors who needed to be civilized. And when Metacom finally decided that enough was enough, that no more concessions were possible, that the only option left was to fight, the English acted shocked. How could their Indian friends turn on them? After all the English had done for them, after that wonderful Thanksgiving feast back in 1621. They had forgotten or chosen to ignore everything they had taken, everything they had destroyed, every promise they had broken, and they were about to pay a terrible price for that willful blindness. The 1621 harvest celebration. Then what? The traditional narrative usually ends there, or maybe mentions that the colony prospered and everyone lived happily ever after. Time for turkey and pie. Roll credits. The end. Except it wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. And what came next was not prosperity and harmony. It was expansion, exploitation, and eventually war. In the years immediately following 1621, Plymouth Colony struggled but survived. More English settlers arrived. The colony grew slowly. The treaty with Massasoit held, though there were tensions and misunderstandings. The Wampanoag continued to teach the English how to survive in this environment, and the English continued to trade goods and, theoretically, offer military support. But the nature of the relationship was changing. As the English became more secure, more established, they needed the Wampanoag less, and as they needed them less, they respected them less. The English started to see themselves not as guests or even as allies, but as the rightful owners of this land, ordained by God to civilize it and rule over it. More English kept coming, not just to Plymouth, but to Massachusetts Bay Colony to the north, founded in 1630. These new arrivals were different from the Plymouth separatists. They were Puritans, yes, but they came in much larger numbers, with more resources, with more explicit goals of establishing a godly commonwealth. They saw the native peoples as obstacles to that vision, as heathens who needed to be converted or removed. The population imbalance shifted dramatically. In 1620, there were maybe 50 English colonists and thousands of Wampanoag, though reduced by disease. By 1640, there were over 10,000 English colonists in New England, and the native population continued to decline, hammered by continuing disease outbreaks. The English now had the numbers to do whatever they wanted. And what they wanted was land. More land, better land. Land for farming, for grazing, for new towns, land that the Wampanoag were using, land that had been Wampanoag territory for thousands of years. The English developed a system for taking this land that had a veneer of legality, but was fundamentally coercive. They would approach a sachem and negotiate a purchase. They would offer trade goods, tools, cloth, weapons, sometimes alcohol. They would pressure the sachem to sign a document written in English that most sachems couldn't read, and then they would claim they had legally purchased exclusive rights to the land. But the Wampanoag didn't have a concept of selling land in this way. You could grant someone the right to use land, to benefit from it, to live on it. But the land itself couldn't be owned exclusively by one person or family. It belonged to the community, to be managed for the collective good. When a sachem signed these documents, they thought they were agreeing to share the land, not giving it away permanently. This fundamental misunderstanding, or deliberate exploitation of cultural differences, led to endless conflict. The English would start fencing land, claiming exclusive use, preventing the Wampanoag from hunting or gathering there. The Wampanoag would protest, saying they never agreed to this. The English would produce the document and say the Wampanoag had sold the land fair and square, and increasingly the English had the power to enforce their interpretation. They established English law over all territories they claimed. If a Wampanoag was accused of a crime, they would be tried in English courts, under English law, with English juries. The treaty provision that each side would administer justice to its own people was forgotten or ignored. The English also brought their livestock, pigs, cattle, goats. These animals were allowed to roam freely, which was English agricultural practice. But in doing so, they destroyed Wampanoag cornfields, trampled gathering areas, scattered game. The Wampanoag would kill the offending animals, which was their right under their understanding of land use. The English would demand compensation and threaten violence. There were attempts at missionary work trying to convert the Wampanoag to Christianity. Some native people did convert, becoming what the English called praying Indians. But these converts were often treated as second-class members of both communities. The English Christians didn't fully accept them as equals, and the traditional Wampanoag saw them as traitors to their culture. The converts were settled in praying towns, separate communities where they were supposed to live according to English customs, give up their traditional ways, cut their hair, wear English clothes, abandon their language. It was cultural genocide dressed up as salvation. Through all of this, Massasoit kept the peace. He had made a commitment. He understood that despite everything, Fighting the English would be even worse for his people than enduring their encroachment. He negotiated. He compromised. He swallowed his pride and his anger again and again. But in 1661, Massasoit died. His son Wamsuta, called Alexander by the English, became Sachem. Wamsuta tried to continue his father's policy of uneasy coexistence. But the English, particularly Plymouth Colony officials, were suspicious of him. They suspected he was planning an uprising, forming alliances with other tribes against them. In 1662, Plymouth officials summoned Wamsuta to answer these accusations. When he didn't come quickly enough, they sent an armed party to bring him in forcibly. They found him at his camp and essentially arrested him. They forced him to travel to Plymouth during illness. A few days later, Wamsuta was dead. The English claimed he died of fever. The Wampanoag were certain he had been poisoned. We'll never know the truth. But the impact was clear. Wamsuta's younger brother Metacom, known to the English as Philip, became Sachem. And unlike his father and brother, Metacom was not inclined to be patient with English abuses. Metacom, often called King Philip by the English, was in his mid-20s when he became Sachem. He had grown up watching the English take more and more from his people. He had seen the promises broken, the treaties violated, the land stolen. He had watched the English population grow while the Wampanoag dwindled, and now his brother was dead, possibly murdered by the very people his father had protected and helped. For more than a decade, Metacom tried to navigate the increasingly impossible situation. He negotiated. He complained to Plymouth officials about English encroachment. He tried to maintain his people's rights and autonomy, but the pressure kept building. The English kept demanding more land, more submission, more conversion, more disarmament. In 1671, Plymouth Colony officials, worried about Metacom's influence and rumours of native alliance building, essentially put him on trial. They forced him to sign a humiliating agreement acknowledging English authority and surrendering much of the Wampanoag's remaining weapons. It was a public humiliation designed to break his power and spirit. It didn't work. If anything, it hardened his resolve. Over the next few years, Metacom quietly built alliances with other tribes who were facing similar pressures from English colonisation. The Nipmuc, the Pocumtuck, groups that had their own grievances against the English. He was preparing for the possibility of war even as he hoped it could be avoided. The spark came in 1675. A Wampanoag man named John Sassamon, who had been educated by the English and served as a scribe and interpreter, came to Plymouth Colony officials with a warning. He said Metacom was planning a general uprising. The officials were sceptical. Sassamon had a complicated reputation, trusted by neither English nor Wampanoag. But a few days later, Sassamon was found dead in a frozen pond, his neck broken. Plymouth officials investigated and decided it was murder, not accident. They arrested 3 Wampanoag men, all counsellors to Metacom. The trial was held in Plymouth, under English law, with an English jury. The 3 men were found guilty and executed in June 1675. This violated the old treaty, the one that said each side would administer justice to its own people. The English had seized Wampanoag men, tried them under English law, and executed them. To Metacom and many Wampanoag, this was the final outrage, the final proof that the English had no respect for Wampanoag's sovereignty or rights. Within days, Wampanoag warriors attacked the English settlement of Swansea, burning homes and killing colonists. King Philip's War had begun, and it would be one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in American history. June 1675. The war that would reshape New England began with fire and screams. Wampanoag warriors struck Swansea, a settlement on the edge of Wampanoag territory. Houses burned, colonists died. The English response was swift and brutal. Militias mustered, soldiers marched, and the fragile peace that Massasoit had maintained for 4 decades shattered completely. This wasn't a small conflict. This wasn't a skirmish. This was total war, and it engulfed all of New England for more than a year. Before it was over, it would kill more people, proportionally, than almost any other war in American history. It would destroy dozens of towns. It would end the Wampanoag as an independent people, and it would demonstrate once and for all that the myth of Pilgrim Indian friendship was exactly that, a myth. Metacom, King Philip, wasn't fighting alone. He had spent years building alliances, and now those alliances activated. The Nipmuc, whose lands had been encroached upon by Massasoit Bay Colony. The Pecumtuck, driven from the Connecticut River Valley. Groups of Abenaki from Maine. Even some of the Narragansett, the old rivals of the Wampanoag, joined the fight after English militias attacked them despite their neutrality. The native strategy was guerrilla warfare. Small groups of warriors would strike suddenly at isolated settlements or farms, burn everything they could, kill the inhabitants or drive them away, and disappear back into the forest before English soldiers could respond. They moved quickly, knew the terrain intimately, and used the environment to their advantage in ways the English couldn't match. Town after town fell. Brookfield burned. Deerfield attacked repeatedly. Springfield partially destroyed. Northampton under siege. Providence, home of Roger Williams, who had always maintained better relations with native peoples, was attacked and partially burned. The English colonists were terrified. They had thought themselves secure, the dominant power. Now they were under constant attack, unable to protect their settlements or pursue their enemies effectively. The English suffered horrific losses. At Bloody Brook in September 1675, Nipmuc warriors ambushed a supply train and killed about 80 English soldiers and teamsters in a devastating surprise attack. It was one of the worst single-day losses the English would suffer. Bodies were scattered along the road. The brook, they said, ran red with blood. But the native forces were suffering too. They couldn't sustain the fight indefinitely. They needed food, ammunition, shelter. They couldn't plant crops because they were constantly moving. They couldn't trade for supplies because the English had cut off trade. The women, children, and elderly who travelled with the warriors suffered from exposure and starvation. And the English, despite their losses, had advantages that would eventually tell. They had more people, far more. For every colonist killed, there were 10 more in the settlements. They had better weapons and more ammunition. They had fortifications and supply lines from England, and they were willing to do absolutely anything to win. In December 1675, the English made a calculated gamble. The Narragansett tribe had been officially neutral, though some Narragansett warriors had joined the fight, and the tribe had given shelter to Wampanoag refugees. The English decided this was enough to justify an attack. A force of about 1,000 English soldiers and 150 native allies from tribes hostile to the Narragansett marched into Rhode Island in the middle of winter. They found the Narragansett's main fort in a frozen swamp near what's now Kingston. The fort was a massive structure, acres in size, housing hundreds of people including warriors, but also women, children and refugees from other tribes. It was supposed to be impregnable, surrounded by palisades and protected by the swamp. On December 19th, in the middle of a snowstorm, the English attacked. This became known as the Great Swamp Fight. The battle was brutal, close quarters fighting in freezing conditions. The English broke through the palisades and poured into the fort. Then they set it on fire. What happened next was a massacre. As the fort burned, people fled the flames. Many were cut down as they ran. Women and children huddled in burning wigwams. The English soldiers, many of them undisciplined militiamen seeking revenge for attacks on their homes, showed little mercy. Estimates of Narragansett deaths range from 300 to over 600. Most were non-combatants, women, children, elderly. The English lost heavily too. Many soldiers were killed or wounded in the attack. Others froze to death on the march back, or died later from wounds and exposure. But they had accomplished their goal. The Narragansett, who had been the largest and strongest native nation in southern New England, were broken. Their main fort was destroyed. Their food stores were gone, their people were scattered and starving. The surviving Narragansett joined the war in earnest. They had stayed neutral or semi-neutral until the English attacked them. Now they fought with nothing left to lose. Through the winter and into spring of 1676, the war continued. Native war parties struck deep into colonial territory. The English settlement of Lancaster was attacked. Mary Rowlandson, a minister's wife, was captured and spent 3 months as a captive before being ransomed. Her account of this experience would become one of the most widely read captivity narratives, though it's filled with her own biases and hatred toward her captors. But by spring, the tide was turning. The native forces were running out of ammunition, food, and safe places to shelter. The English were importing more soldiers and supplies from England, and crucially, some native groups, recognizing that Metacom's cause was likely doomed, were making peace with the English or even actively fighting against the alliance. The Mohawk, traditional enemies of the Algonquin peoples, entered the war on the English side. In February 1676, they ambushed a large force under Metacom's command, killing dozens or hundreds of his warriors. This was devastating, both in terms of losses and morale. By summer, Metacom's forces were fractured and desperate. Many warriors had surrendered or been killed. Others had fled west or north, trying to escape English retaliation. Metacom himself was on the run, moving through the swamps and forests of his homeland with a small group of loyal followers. In August 1676, English forces led by Captain Benjamin Church, who had learned to fight using native tactics, closed in. A Wampanoag warrior named Alderman, angry at Metacom for killing his brother, led the English to Metacom's hiding place near Mount Hope, the heart of Wampanoag territory. On August 12, 1676, just before dawn, English soldiers surrounded the camp. Metacom tried to flee through the swamp. Alderman shot him through the heart. King Philip, the son of Massasoit, who had helped the Plymouth colonists survive, who had tried for years to coexist with the English, who had finally fought to defend his people's land and freedom, was dead at 38 years old. The English desecrated his body. They cut off his head and hands. The head was displayed on a pike at Plymouth Fort for 25 years. The hands were given to Alderman as a trophy. The rest of the body was quartered and the parts hung in trees like a hunting trophy. This was how the English treated the son of the man who had saved their colony. Metacom's wife and his young son, about 9 years old, were captured. There was debate about what to do with them. Some English argued they should be enslaved. Others said the boy, being Massasoit's grandson, was too dangerous to let live and should be executed. In the end, they were both sold into slavery in the West Indies, shipped away from their homeland to die in bondage in some sugar plantation. The last of Massasoit's line, the son of the Sachem who had sat at that harvest feast in 1621, disappeared into slavery and was never heard from again. The war officially ended in August 1676, though fighting continued in Maine for another 2 years. The toll was staggering. Of the 90 English settlements in New England, more than half had been attacked, and 12 were completely destroyed. About 600 English colonists and soldiers had been killed, roughly 1 in 16 of the entire English population of New England. But the native losses were catastrophic. Estimates suggest that between 2,000 and 3,000 native warriors and non-combatants were killed in battle. Hundreds more died of exposure, starvation and disease. Hundreds, possibly thousands, were sold into slavery, shipped to the Caribbean or to the Mediterranean to labour and die far from their homelands. The ones who survived and remained free were scattered, displaced, or forced onto small reservations under English supervision. The Wampanoag nation, which had welcomed and helped the Plymouth colonists in 1621, which had maintained peace for 40 years despite endless provocation, was destroyed. Their land was taken. Their political independence was ended. Their way of life was shattered. Within a generation of that famous Thanksgiving feast, they had ceased to exist as a free people. The English, meanwhile, had learned valuable lessons about colonial warfare that they would apply in future conflicts. They had learned that native peoples could be conquered through overwhelming force, destruction of their food supplies, and exploitation of intertribal conflicts. They had learned that mercy was a weakness, and that total victory required total war. And they had learned something else, that it was easier to believe in the myth of the friendly Indians who helped the Pilgrims than to confront the reality of what they had done to the people who had shown them kindness. So they began creating that myth in earnest. For more than 150 years after that harvest feast in 1621, nobody talked about it much. It wasn't considered particularly important. William Bradford mentioned it briefly in his history. Edward Winslow wrote a paragraph in a letter. That was it. No monuments, no annual celebrations, no national mythology. What the colonists did celebrate were fast days and Thanksgiving days, but these were religious observances, not secular feasts. They were proclaimed in response to specific events: a military victory, the end of a drought, recovery from disease. These were solemn days of prayer and fasting, not days of eating turkey and pie. The 1621 event specifically wasn't commemorated at all in Plymouth Colony. It wasn't seen as the founding moment of anything. It was just one harvest celebration among many, notable mainly because it had lasted 3 days and involved a lot of native guests. So how did this forgotten event become the Central American holiday? How did it transform from a minor diplomatic meeting into a sacred national story about pilgrims and Indians sharing friendship and gratitude? The transformation began in the 19th century, part of a broader pattern of myth-making about American origins. The young United States, still defining its identity, was looking for founding stories that could unite different regions and create a sense of shared heritage. The Revolution provided some of these stories, but the Revolution was divisive, had been a war against fellow English people. Americans wanted something deeper, something that went back further, something that could represent American values without the conflict. Enter the Pilgrims. By the 1820s, the Mayflower passengers were being reframed as the forefathers, the original Americans. The 200th anniversary of Plymouth Colony's founding in 1820 saw major celebrations and speeches, including a famous one by Daniel Webster that cast the Pilgrims as heroic founders of American freedom and democracy. This was mythology, not history. The Pilgrims hadn't been particularly democratic. They hadn't been particularly free-thinking. They'd been religious separatists trying to create a pure church, not a free society. But the myth was more useful than the reality. The 1621 harvest feast got caught up in this mythologizing. In 1841, a man named Alexander Young published a collection of historical documents about Plymouth Colony. When he came across Edward Winslow's brief description of the 1621 feast, he added a footnote. This was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England. That footnote changed history. Young wasn't trying to be deceptive. He was making a connection between the 1621 harvest feast and the Thanksgiving celebrations that were common in New England by his time. But his footnote began the process of transforming a minor diplomatic gathering into the first Thanksgiving, the sacred origin of the holiday. The timing was important. The 1840s and 1850s saw increasing sectional tension between North and South over slavery and states' rights. People were looking for unifying national symbols, and there was one woman in particular who saw Thanksgiving as a way to create national unity. Her name was Sarah Josepha Hale. She was the editor of Godey's Ladies' Book, the most influential women's magazine in America, and for 17 years she campaigned relentlessly for Thanksgiving to become a national holiday. Hale wrote editorials every year arguing for a national Thanksgiving. She wrote letters to governors, asking them to proclaim Thanksgiving on the same day. She wrote to presidents, urging them to make it a federal holiday. She argued that Thanksgiving could unite Americans from all regions in shared gratitude and celebration. She also wrote fiction and essays that romanticized the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving. She described elaborate feasts with tables groaning under turkeys and pies, and all manner of good things. She created the domestic ideal of Thanksgiving as a family gathering, a day of gratitude and togetherness. None of this bore much resemblance to 1621, but it appealed to her readers. Finally, in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln responded to Hale's campaign and proclaimed a National Thanksgiving Day to be celebrated on the last Thursday of November. His proclamation called for Americans to give thanks even amid the war, to heal divisions, to remember their shared blessings. Lincoln's proclamation made Thanksgiving a national holiday, but it still didn't directly reference the Pilgrims or the 1621 feast. That connection solidified gradually over the next few decades through school curricula, popular literature and art. Paintings like Jenny Brownscomb's The First Thanksgiving at Plymouth, 1914, created powerful visual images of pilgrims and Indians feasting together that had nothing to do with historical reality but everything to do with national myth-making. By the early 20th century, the myth was fully formed. Every schoolchild learned about the Pilgrims in their tall hats and buckled shoes, which they never wore, teaching the friendly Indians how to pray, which they never did, and everyone sharing turkey and pie, which probably wasn't there, in a spirit of harmony and gratitude that would continue forever, which it absolutely didn't. The myth erased everything that complicated the story. It erased the fact that the Pilgrims landed on a depopulated site cleared by disease. It erased the grave robbing and theft. It erased that Tisquantum had been enslaved. It erased that the alliance was political strategy, not friendship. It erased the land theft, the broken treaties, the forced conversion attempts. It erased King Philip's War and the destruction of the Wampanoag nation. It erased the centuries of genocide and cultural destruction that followed European colonization. Instead, it offered a simple story. Brave pilgrims seeking freedom came to an empty wilderness. Friendly Indians helped them. They shared a feast. Everyone was grateful. America was born. Roll credits. This myth serves a purpose. It allows Americans to celebrate a national holiday without confronting the genocidal foundations of European colonization. It frames Thanksgiving as an innocent celebration of gratitude rather than what it is, a holiday built on deliberate erasure of native experiences and perspectives. And Native Americans haven't forgotten. They haven't bought into the myth. They know what really happened to their ancestors. And since 1970, they've been making sure everyone else knows too. November 26, 1970. Plymouth, Massachusetts. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is celebrating the 350th anniversary of the Mayflower landing with a big festival, speeches, and ceremonies. Everything is planned to celebrate this glorious founding moment in American history. But something unexpected is about to happen. The state had invited Frank James, also called Wamsuta, a member of the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe, to speak at a banquet. They wanted a Native American voice to be part of the celebration, to bless the myth with indigenous participation. They figured he would say something gracious about Pilgrim-Indian friendship, thank the Europeans for bringing civilization, and help legitimize the historical narrative. Wamsuta James wrote his speech. He submitted it to the organizers for approval, as requested. And then he got a phone call. The speech was unacceptable. He would not be allowed to give it. It was, they said, too inflammatory, too political, too negative. They offered him a sanitized alternative speech, written by the public relations team that he could read instead. James refused. If he couldn't speak the truth, he wouldn't speak at all. Instead, he and a group of other native activists organized a counter-event on Coles Hill, the place where the Plymouth colonists had buried their dead in, secret during that first brutal winter, the place overlooking the famous Plymouth Rock. On Thanksgiving Day, 1970, about 500 Native Americans from across the country gathered on Coles Hill while the official Massachusetts celebration went on nearby. And Wamsuta James gave his suppressed speech. Let me share part of it, because his words are powerful. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod for 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn and beans. Massasoit, the The great Sachem of the Wampanoag knew these facts, yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers of Plymouth Plantation. Perhaps he did this because his tribe had been depleted by an epidemic, or his knowledge of the harsh oncoming winter was the reason for his peaceful acceptance of these acts. This action by Massasoit was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end, that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. He went on to describe the history of broken treaties, land theft and violence. He talked about the reality of life for Native Americans in 1970. Poverty, discrimination, cultural erasure, ongoing oppression. He refused to participate in the myth of Thanksgiving as a day of harmony and gratitude. We are uniting. We are standing not in our wigwams, but in your concrete tent. We stand tall and proud, and before too many moons pass we'll right the wrongs we have allowed to happen to us. We forfeited our country. Our lands have fallen into the hands of the aggressor. We have allowed the white man to keep us on our knees. What has happened cannot be changed, but today we must work towards a more humane America, a more Indian America, where men and nature once again are important, where the Indian values of honour, truth and brotherhood prevail. This wasn't grateful. This wasn't conciliatory. This was a declaration of resistance, a refusal to cooperate in the whitewashing of history. And it sparked something. That gathering on Coles Hill became the first National Day of Mourning. It has been held every year since 1970, every fourth Thursday of November. At the same time, most Americans are preparing their Thanksgiving feasts. Native Americans and their allies gather in Plymouth to remember the truth, to mourn their ancestors, and to protest the ongoing injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. The National Day of Mourning has several purposes. First, it's about historical truth. It's about telling the real story of what happened in 1621 and afterward, not the sanitized myth. It's about education, making sure people understand that Thanksgiving is not an innocent celebration of friendship, but a holiday built on erasure of genocide. Second, it's about mourning. It's a day to grieve for the ancestors who died from disease, war and oppression, to remember the millions of Native Americans who were killed in the centuries following European contact, to honour the cultures and languages and ways of life that were destroyed. Third, it's about contemporary struggle, because the oppression of Native Americans didn't end in 1676 or 1890 or even 1970. It's ongoing. Native Americans continue to face poverty, discrimination, health disparities, and threats to their sovereignty and land rights. The National Day of Mourning connects historical injustice to present-day issues. The United American Indians of New England, the organization that organizes the National Day of Mourning, puts it simply on their website. Many native people do not celebrate the arrival of the Pilgrims and other European settlers. Thanksgiving Day is a reminder of the genocide of millions of native people, the theft of native lands, and the erasure of native cultures. Not everyone appreciates this message. There have been attempts to shut down or control the National Day of Mourning. In 1997, Plymouth police brutally arrested 25 protesters, leading to a court case that eventually affirmed the protesters' First Amendment rights and resulted in the town installing historical plaques acknowledging the Indigenous perspective. One of these plaques, placed on Coles Hill, reads, "Since 1970, Native Americans have gathered at noon on Coles Hill in Plymouth to commemorate a National Day of Mourning on the US Thanksgiving holiday." Many Native Americans do not celebrate the arrival of the Pilgrims and other European settlers. To them, Thanksgiving Day is a reminder of the genocide of millions of their people, the theft of their lands, and the relentless assault on their cultures. Participants in National Day of Mourning honour Native ancestors and the struggles of Native peoples to survive today. The National Day of Mourning has inspired similar observances in other places and has influenced how Thanksgiving is taught in some schools. More educators are beginning to include Native perspectives, to complicate the simple myth, to acknowledge the darker truths. But let's be clear, Most Americans don't know about the National Day of Mourning. Most still believe the Thanksgiving myth they learned as children. The holiday is still celebrated without any reference to the reality of what happened to native peoples. The historical amnesia is widespread and for many intentional. It's easier to believe in the myth than to confront the truth. Keisha James, granddaughter of Wamsuta James and a current organizer of the National Day of Mourning, has said, "Endom is important because it corrects the historical record about what happened to Native Americans following the arrival of the Pilgrims. We Native people have no reason to celebrate the arrival of the Pilgrims. We want to educate people so that they understand the stories we all learned in school about the first Thanksgiving are nothing but lies." The National Day of Mourning continues to grow. Each year, more. People attend. The message spreads through social media. Native voices that were suppressed for centuries are finding ways to be heard. The myth is being challenged, even if it's not yet broken. And that's what makes this uncomfortable. That's why many people resist hearing about the National Day of Mourning or get defensive when the Thanksgiving myth is questioned. Because once you know the truth, you can't go back to the comfortable lie. Once you understand that this holiday is built on erasure and mythology designed to cover up genocide, it changes how you think about it. Some people argue that we can still celebrate Thanksgiving if we focus on gratitude and family rather than the historical myth. That's fine as far as it goes, but we should at least be honest about what we're celebrating and what we're choosing to ignore. We should acknowledge that for many Native Americans, this is not a day of gratitude, but a day of mourning, and we should listen when they tell us their side of the story. So here we are. We started with a myth. Brave pilgrims and friendly Indians sharing a feast, giving thanks, beginning a beautiful friendship that symbolizes American values of gratitude, cooperation and freedom. And we've traced what really happened. We've seen the Wampanoag Nation, thriving for thousands of years before European contact, devastated by disease that killed up to 90% of the population between 1616 and 1619. We've seen the Patuxet village completely destroyed, everyone dead, leaving Tisquantum as the last survivor when he returned from 5 years of slavery and exile in Europe. We've seen the Mayflower arrive, filled with desperate English colonists who were unprepared for survival in this environment. We've seen nearly half of them die in the first winter, and we've seen them steal food from native storage sites and rob native graves in their desperation. We've seen that the first Thanksgiving of 1621 was not a religious celebration or an annual tradition, but a 3-day harvest feast and diplomatic meeting that happened once, where political and military considerations dominated, where the Wampanoag outnumbered the English and brought most of the food. We've seen that Massasoit's decision to ally with the English was strategic, not sentimental, driven by his people's weakened state after disease and the threat from rival tribes. We've seen how Tisquantum, far from being a simple friendly Indian, was a complex survivor of trauma who tried to play both sides for his own benefit and died mysteriously after being accused of manipulation. We've seen how the English, once they became strong enough, began taking more and more land, breaking the treaty, treating the Wampanoag as subjects rather than allies, and eventually provoking a war that would destroy the Wampanoag as an independent nation. We've seen King Philip's War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history per capita, where the son of Massasoit, who had helped the Plymouth colonists, led a desperate resistance against overwhelming English expansion and died with his body desecrated, his head displayed on a pike, and his wife and son sold into slavery. And we've seen how, centuries later, this complicated, tragic, violent history was deliberately simplified and sanitized into a myth about friendship and gratitude, a myth that serves the interests of the descendants of the colonizers while erasing the experiences and perspectives of native peoples. Why does this matter? Why can't we just enjoy our turkey and pie and family time without worrying about events that happened 400 years ago? It matters because history isn't dead. It's not past. The choices made in the 1620s, the patterns of colonization and land theft and cultural destruction that began then, continued for centuries and shaped the America we live in today. Native Americans still live with the consequences of these choices. They still face poverty, discrimination, health disparities, and threats to their sovereignty that can be traced directly back to the colonial period and the myths we tell about it. It matters because the Thanksgiving myth is part of a larger pattern of American mythology that makes it hard to address ongoing injustices. If we believe that America was founded on cooperation and gratitude between Europeans and native peoples, then we don't have to confront the reality that it was founded on conquest, disease, and genocide. We can feel good about ourselves and our history without doing the hard work of acknowledging harm and making repairs. It matters because Native Americans are still here. They're still fighting for their rights, their sovereignty, their cultures, and their survival, and they're still being told to be grateful, to get over it, to stop living in the past. But how can they get over it when the past keeps being misrepresented, when their side of the story keeps being silenced, when a national holiday explicitly celebrates a mythology that erases their suffering? It matters because truth matters. History isn't just about the past, it's about how we understand the present and imagine the future. If we base our understanding on myths rather than reality, we make bad decisions. We perpetuate injustices. We fail to see patterns that keep repeating. So what do we do with this knowledge? How should we approach Thanksgiving now that we know the truth? First, we can acknowledge it. We can stop teaching children the simplified myth and start teaching them the complex reality. We can include Native perspectives in how we talk about this holiday. We can recognise that for many Native Americans, Thanksgiving is a day of mourning, not celebration, and respect that experience. Second, we can educate ourselves. The National Day of Mourning is live-streamed every year. Wamsuta James's suppressed speech is available to read. There are many books, documentaries and resources by Native historians and activists that tell these stories from Indigenous perspectives. We can seek these out and listen. Third, we can support Native peoples today. Not just in abstract ways, but concretely. Support Native sovereignty and land rights. Support Native-led organisations working on issues like healthcare, education and cultural preservation. Learn whose traditional land you live on and what happened to the people who lived there. Pay attention to contemporary Native voices and struggles. And fourth, we can be honest about what Thanksgiving is. If you celebrate it, acknowledge that it's a holiday built on a myth designed to cover up genocide. You don't have to stop celebrating if it has meaning for you as a day of gratitude and family. But at least be honest about its origins and implications. Maybe take a moment during your celebration to acknowledge the Native peoples whose land you're on and what happened to them. Maybe donate to a Native-led organisation. Maybe educate your family about the real history. The Thanksgiving myth is comfortable. It's simple. It makes us feel good about America and its founding. But comfort is not more important than truth. And the Native Americans who gather every year on Coles Hill for the National Day of Mourning, who refuse to let the myth go unchallenged, who insist that we remember what really happened, they deserve to be heard. In 1621, the Wampanoag showed extraordinary compassion and strategic wisdom in helping the English colonists survive. They shared their knowledge, their food, their land. They maintained peace for 40 years despite constant provocation. And in return, they were destroyed. Their land was stolen, their people were killed or enslaved, their culture was attacked, and then, centuries later, their generosity was transformed into a myth that erases what was done to them. That's the dark truth about the first Thanksgiving. Not that people gathered and ate together in 1621. That part happened, but that we've turned a minor diplomatic event into a sacred American myth that covers up genocide and allows us to avoid confronting the brutal reality of colonization. The least we can do is remember the truth, to honour the Wampanoag and all native peoples by acknowledging what happened to them, by listening to their voices now, by understanding that the comfortable myth we've been told is a lie designed to make colonizers feel better about conquest. So this Thanksgiving, as you gather with family, as you express gratitude for what you have, take a moment. Remember the Wampanoag. Remember Tisquantum, stolen from his home and returning to find everyone dead. Remember Massasoit, who chose peace and saw his people destroyed anyway. Remember Metacom, who fought for his people's survival and died with his body mutilated and his family enslaved. Remember the thousands of Native Americans who died from disease, violence, and displacement. Remember that their descendants are still here, still surviving, still fighting, still demanding that the truth be told. That's how we honour history. Not by repeating comfortable myths, but by confronting uncomfortable truths. Not by celebrating false narratives of friendship, but by acknowledging the brutal reality of conquest and its ongoing consequences. Not by forgetting, but by remembering. The dark truth about the first Thanksgiving is that it was never about friendship. It was about survival, politics, and the beginning of a catastrophic collision between two worlds. One world would grow and prosper, the other would be nearly destroyed, and we owe it to the survivors and descendants of that destruction to at least tell the truth about what happened. Remember the real story. Honour the real people. Acknowledge the real consequences. That's the least we can do. And if that makes Thanksgiving dinner a little less comfortable, maybe that's appropriate. Maybe we should be a little uncomfortable about a holiday built on such profound injustice. The Wampanoag deserve that much. The truth deserves that much. And so do we, if we want to build a future based on honesty rather than mythology. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.